Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning, or you might be tuning in after we've done our live stream, in which case, whatever time of the day it is, welcome. Thank you for joining our Library in Your Lounge Room series. My name is Lucy Mays. I'm the Acting Manager of Engagement for Goldfields Libraries, and we have 17 sites of service delivery across 4 local government areas, so you might be joining us from any of those places. And sorry, we're having a little technical glitch. Nat, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Are you able to help me with that? I'm still getting my feedback. I'll try taking my... That's better. Sorry, everybody. Technical glitches. We're doing our best, learning how to do online processes. I'm going to try without my speakers. So before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting with you today from Dja country, and our libraries sit across the Kulin Nations. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we meet on. And I think it's timely to acknowledge, we're talking about tenancy rights today. And the traditional owners of our lands are, of course, the original ones who needed to assert their tenancy rights. Heather, are you getting feedback as well?
I can hear your difficulties, Lucy, but so far not.
I've got my phone turned right off. It's timely to acknowledge. It's actually playing back through my laptop. The original ones who needed to assert it. I'm so sorry, everybody. Here we are. That's better. Oh, that's peaceful. I'm really sorry about that. Do bear with us. It'll get better from here. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a really important topic at a really important time, and how fantastic that a role such as yours exists. And I believe it's the first time that we in Victoria have had a Commissioner for Residential Tenancies. So Dr. Heather Holst, who's with us this morning, I'll just tell you a little bit about her. This is a very impressive and interesting background. So before taking up her role as Commissioner, Heather was Deputy CEO of Launch Housing, which followed a merger of Homeground and Hanover in 2015. And she was originally CEO of Homeground. Homeground was real estate was a very innovative model, and Heather's contributed to other key innovations. But this one in particular was Australia's only not-for-profit real estate agency. Heather's experience spans homelessness services, housing management, tenant advice, policy and research in both not-for-profits and governments since 1989. Heather's an adjunct lecturer in history at the University of New South Wales and a board member of the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. And Heather also lives in the Goldfields area. So Heather, thanks again for your time this morning, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. The structure of today's session is that we'll be looking at the before, the during and the after, and of course the event that we're talking about is the event that's turned all of our lives upside down, but most particularly, well, I shouldn't say most particularly, lots of areas have been affected, but residential tenancies and renters' rights are an area that have been hugely impacted by coronavirus. But before we go into the before, Heather, I just wondered if you wouldn't mind. Commission is a fairly big word, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind demystifying that for us and letting us know a bit more about your role and what it is that a commissioner does.
Thanks, Lucy. It's my pleasure to be here talking to people through the Goldfields Libraries network too. It's a fantastic library system, absolutely wonderful. So yeah, the Commissioner for Residential Tenancies is a big title, which is sort of on purpose, I guess, because it was announced as part of the reforms to residential rental that I'll be talking a bit more about as we go on today. Let me think, it was September 2018 that all came through Parliament. So the idea of the commissioner roles, and there's a few of us in different sort of roles around Victoria, but only one residential tenancies one. The idea is where there's a bit of a problem with representation into policy making, law making, where there's a big power difference, such as a commissioner for children and young people is another one, for example, then sometimes governments decide to appoint a commissioner to try to round up voices that are very hard to hear otherwise, and make them much more heard into policy making. So there are another couple of important bodies, like Tenants Victoria, for example, is a very important representation group. But the thing with the commissioner roles is they tend to be within government and have access to some things as they're happening, I suppose, to give advice and try to, kind of emphasise certain voices. So that's the idea with this one.
Yeah. What a wonderful opportunity, giving voice to the voiceless. It's a pet passion of mine too. So, and it sounds like it's a role where you can close that loop, understanding the realities going both ways. So
never quite to my satisfaction, but but you've got to, but it's trying. I mean, yeah, it's a big problem, that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a problem that's I guess come to the fore in the awareness of the general public, I suppose, in this current environment. So hopefully that gives an even greater opportunity to continue advocacy, and that some of the changes and awareness raising has a lasting effect beyond COVID. So if you could just explain a little bit more about what the scenario was before this pandemic hit, and what the laws were, and why there might have been a need for reform, which is of course where we've come to now.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. So we're partway through implementing the reforms that came through Parliament in September 2018. And the basic problems, as I'll characterise it, for tenants in Victoria, like tenants around Australia, is cost. Often, rents are, hard to afford, or you're really stretching for them. Sometimes there's cost problems with the running of the home as well, such as inefficient heating, inefficient cooling, those sort of things that are harder to control when it's not your own place. So cost is a big cluster of issues. The condition of the properties is another big cluster, and we actually have not yet implemented basic standards in rental housing, which sounds a bit shocking when you say it out loud. So a property can be condemned as a public health risk, but apart from that, it's, so that work is going on right now to write the regulations for what condition the property needs to be in to be offered for rent and kept for rent. I can remember an example, quite shocking actually, where a woman was telling me that she had recently got a guide dog because she had low sight, and the people who looked after the guide dog were so concerned about the condition of the property she was living in that they didn't want her to have the guide dog in the property. So when there can be that sort of it's like you couldn't make it up with craziness. So the level of properties need to all be at a certain basic standard. Look, I don't mean to say there aren't very good properties, of course there are, but it's about everybody being able to rely on a certain basic level. And then I think the third kind of cluster of problems are to do with whether you can really think of yourself as having a home when you're renting. So that goes to whether someone from the agent to the landlord can pop in. The answer is they can't, but many do. Whether you can receive a notice to vacate unpredictably, or even in sort of retaliation for asking for something. So that sort of sense of home, whether you can put a picture up or put in a garden bed, if you're lucky enough to have outdoor areas, all those sort of things. And so I would say that the drive in these rental reforms in Victoria has all been towards those kind of ameliorating those problems. Cost, not too much being done about cost. There's no, apart from COVID, which we'll get to, where there are things being done about cost, but there's been still a kind of, well, the market will find its level sort of philosophy. Yeah, so I would say they're the three main kind of issues. I'd also say that renting is a much more common thing to be living in now. So in the 20 years, from 1996 to 2016, there were 61% more rental households in Victoria. So it's by far the fastest growing area. I mean, that's part of that's population increase that's lifting all types of households, but rental is growing by far the fastest. And so there were about 627,000 rental households. Within that, of course, there's more people at that census 4 years ago. So it is becoming a much bigger segment of the voting population, let's face it. And, you know, some electorates are as much as 70% rental households, and some of those inner urban electorates. Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
And we all know that housing affordability is a major issue and going to become more so in the future. I don't think the dream of owning one's own home is necessarily a realistic one for everybody, and will become less so.
Seems so. Yeah, that's right.
I meant to say before I started, and apologies, please do join in our conversation by putting your chat in the chat box. I've got the chat box open now that I've figured out my tech issues, and sorry, this morning has not been my friend from a technology perspective, which is why I've got my coffee. But actually also this is all part of Library in Your Lounge Room, which is bring your own drink and make yourself at home. You're in my lounge room, and I hope that we're in yours. And this is how we're doing, how we're bringing services and programs to people while we have our library buildings closed at the moment. So thanks, Heather. That's been really interesting understanding where the need for reform is, and I can see why you've got some challenges ahead of you in advocating for some of those reforms, because they're complex and layered. So I guess if you could just bring us now into the present moment, and COVID's presented an opportunity for some very quick reform. The temporary legislation only lasts for 6 months, but hopefully it might have some longer lasting impact. Can you explain a bit more about what's happened as the state government tries to look after tenants in this climate?
Yeah, sure, Lucy. So it's all been quite a flurry, and the final piece of it only got put in place last week. So as people will spot there, getting it into place mid-May, when really the bottom fell out of income for so many people in March, with some pretty big indications things were going to go bad in February, is one of the problems. So people who watch this space will have, you know, watched National Cabinet, premiers, chief ministers and prime minister meeting and making some pretty far-reaching decisions about income support and other law. So for a while we thought that was going to come through with private rental as well, but it became apparent that was going to be left to each state and territory to do. So what Victoria went forward and enacted is basically the real nub of it is that as a tenant, if you've lost income because of COVID lockdown, you can ask for a rent reduction. And that will be made into a formal agreement that is binding, backdated to the 29th of March, which is when the Prime Minister made the announcement about, he called it an eviction moratorium, which would have been great if it had really happened. There's a few loopholes in it, but in terms of preventing many types of evictions, it's further than we've ever seen since the Second World War, actually, which is, you know, a long time now. So the process is, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this in case anyone listening is themselves or can give advice to someone who's in this predicament. So your first step is to contact the owner of the property, either via the agent or directly if you rent directly, And there's some, Tenants Victoria have got some sample letters on their website that you can download and use if you're not quite sure what to say or how to start it. To say to the owner, look, I'm in a mess with my income, I've lost income, I need to ask you for a rent reduction. Now, it's also very important that in Victoria, these are rent reductions, not deferrals. And so I would really advise people not to be tempted to say, look, I just need a reduction now, I'll pay it all back later, because rent will pile up and we don't need to see a whole lot of people just deferring their moment of truth and eviction, basically. So the law that's been enacted is that you are entitled to ask for and receive a rent reduction. Now, if that doesn't go well, and it hasn't for a lot of people, it has gone very well for some. But if it doesn't go well, your next step immediately, same day, is get onto Consumer Affairs. So Consumer Affairs Victoria is the so-called front door for assisting people to make these rent reduction arrangements. And they will help you. And if they can't, they will put you through to a dispute resolution service that is being run out of the same department, who will sit down virtually, probably like we are today, with both parties and make agreements. And if that doesn't work because things are really a little bit at loggerheads, then VCAT, which is the tribunal that hears tenancy matters, can make reductions for you. So what I really want to tell tenants is that you are entitled to ask and you're entitled to get a reasonable reduction. Now, I appreciate that many landlords have also found themselves with upset income arrangements. And there are some things to help landlords out of that. So if they're mortgaged, they can get a deferral on their mortgage payments from their banks. If they enter into an agreement with their tenant, they can get a land tax reduction from the government, and they can get a rent relief grant that'll go some part towards the gap if the tenant is still paying more than 30% of their income in rent. So there's, like any of these schemes, there are a few conditions, but it is a relatively straightforward scheme, and there's 500 million in that fund for land tax exemptions and rent relief grants. So for the 6 months from the 29th of March to the 26th of September. So do not be shy, go forward and arrange that. People are often embarrassed or don't want to seem like a bad tenant, don't want to cause a fuss or stir the possum, as we say. But this is a really, really widespread problem.
Or risk losing their home, which if they don't know their rights, they would be
worried about
afraid
that.
of. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Look, there's a couple of other things that have happened. So there's no rent increases allowed from the March 29 for 6 months. So if you have received a rent increase, and we were hearing some really unfortunate stories at the office about people getting in early with rent increases because they thought this might be coming. That's illegal. They would have to be wiped out. And you can't be listed on a tenancy database, which a lot of tenants are worried about getting a bad rental history. That you can't be listed for these reasons. So there's a few good protections there, and that's whether you're living in a caravan or a rooming house or disability accommodation, as a share housing, as well as an ordinary residential arrangement. So it's quite wide. International students are covered, you name it. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. Great. And I notice on your website that you encourage people to register if they have got such an arrangement in place informally with their landlord. Do you have any sense of the level of uptake and response that there's been from, whether these negotiations have gone relatively well by and large, or have they been disputed by landlords, or do you know what sort of uptake there's been from tenants?
I know that in the first couple of days there were over 4,000 registrations when the agreements opened for registration, but they were probably the easier ones to arrange that were just waiting to be registered. And that's an important part of the step too, Lucy, that having made an agreement with between the parties, you go ahead and register it with Consumer Affairs. But that data is going to be really rich, and I know that Consumer Affairs are keeping a close eye on what's happening. And then I think that there's, and you know, I would encourage people to speak up to if they're encountering difficulties, and I'd like to hear about that if they are, so that we can tweak things along the way. There is, in times like this, when you're making big public policy changes, a $500 million fund for 6 months is pretty unusual in residential tenancies. You know, you can't get it all right at the beginning. So I know that, you know, if you're encountering difficulties, it will be people who are using it who need to let us know so we can feed that through to get some changes made.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess that's how we're all having to operate in this environment, because it's been such a fast about turn, hasn't it?
Yeah, indeed.
So whilst it feels like a bureaucratic nightmare for people who are having to try and access these services, on the other end, it's been a bit of a nightmare trying to facilitate them and get them organised, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, but that's the least of it. I mean, people who are thinking, how do I pay the rent? And I know, you know, the country town where we live is filled up with 20-somethings who have been in the city and have had to come out of share houses because they can't manage it. You know, it's been very quick. We haven't got the stats yet, but you know, something like 1 in 8 tenants appear to have had to move in the first month. Yeah.
And another short-term trend I've heard about too is people who own second properties as an income stream and have had them on the short stays market. You made me think of it when you talked about our small town, which is full of them. But they also have lost all of their income and are now trying to have flooded the longer-term rental market with these properties, trying to get secure tenants into them. Is that something that you've heard much about or aware of as an issue?
That's happening all over Australia. And, you know, owners of those properties would be wise to do that, because incoming tourism is not going to lift anytime soon by the look of things. And, you know, people will be able to move around Australia a little more at some stage if all goes in the way it's going now. But, yeah, there won't be the same sort of incoming tourism for sure. Yeah. So that's actually providing, in places like Hobart, it's been really stark apparently, because they had a lot of property tied up in Airbnb and similar short stay.
Absolutely. I'm just mindful of the time, how it flies. So I think you've actually covered the question I had here, which is, if I can't reach an agreement with my landlord, what do I do next? And you've given us the steps. And just to let everybody know who's listening, we'll put up some contact details at the end so that you've got those contact points for those steps that Heather's mentioned to us. Heather, I know part of your role is also to collect stories to help with your advocacy piece back to government. Is it too early for stories to have come out of this moment in time that are feeding into longer term reform thinking?
No, and I'm really grateful when people take a moment to write to me. There's a link on my website to do that, because there's nothing as persuasive actually as a story. So I would encourage people to do that. We're getting quite a few accounts from people in share houses. They seem to have been pretty quickly affected, because you know, the share house economy in each place isn't necessarily got much fat in it. So that's a pretty obvious one.
So what sorts of things are you seeing? Are you seeing, you know, just say there are 3 people sharing, one of them can't afford the rent anymore, so they leave, and the other 2 are left facing eviction? Is that the...
Yes, that's actually a really good summary. Yeah, and I understand that it's really hard to get new share tenants at the moment. I mean, people are reluctant to move, particularly with people they may not know, but also a lot of people are having to hunker down, move in with friends or family. If they're a casual and are only able to get job seeker, and there was a delay until you could actually get payment. Rent doesn't stop while that happens. And that was before this scheme that we just talked about was in place. Even though we knew it was coming, people just went, oh, just haven't got any margin for error, I'm going to have to step out here. So yeah, there is a problem. One of the positions we argued for was that if one person in a share house really needed to leave, but the others wanted to stay, there should be a way to just at least even temporarily remove that person from the agreement so that they weren't liable for anything anymore. And the other people didn't necessarily have to take another third of the rent up, but they would be able to get arrange a reduction. So, you know, there are ways that it could be done, and that's one of the things we'll be feeding back to the tweaks that I was talking about before. But we are generally hearing that a lot of people have been having some trouble having those conversations.
Gosh, it must be a very frightening situation to be in. Are you aware of any pushback from landlords at all who are reluctant to follow through on the new laws?
No, I'm not hearing that. I'm sure there's such a variety of landlords. One of the big things with the way rental works in Australia is that there are tens of thousands of landlords, probably actually hundreds of thousands would be more accurate, who hold one or two properties. So it's an incredibly wide kind of group of people with all sorts of different drivers, you know, what means, so it's not like some countries where there are a bigger, what are called institutional landlords who hold a lot of property and are highly kind of, you know, they're just very matter of fact and business-like about it, sometimes to a fault, but, you know, it's very diverse in Victoria. Now, I think mostly what people are doing is once they know what the rules are, it was hard for everybody when we didn't know that. But once people know what the rules are, they tend to be going, oh, well, okay, I understand why. And there are, as I say, some funds as well that they can get access to, not huge, but at least they're helpful in terms of land tax exemptions and the rent relief grants.
Okay. And are you aware of any, given that lag time between the income crisis and the response, and the precariousness of that situation for many people, are you aware of whether there's been much extra demand on homelessness services or public housing lists, which are already completely overwhelmed and unable to service need as it is? But
I believe so. I mean, some of the homeless services are needing to move to a lot of phone contact, and to move to a lot of phone contact rather than face-to-face. I know that, you know, many of them are really focusing on getting the rough sleeper unhoused populations inside because of the extreme, I mean, it's always a health risk, but absolutely extreme. And there's been, again, some support from government to help that happen, which we hope will not just be dropped and everybody out at the end. So, yeah, those things flow through, but I fear there's a bit more of a pent-up situation that could really roll through if things don't get smoothed in this process, and then when it tapers off, you know, there's a really kind of big risk point as well when some of these arrangements end at the end of September.
That's right.
Everyone could be right back to your own resources, and that could be pretty dire.
Yeah, I did find myself wondering that, but it was good that you made the point that it doesn't bank up. So as long as people are aware that they shouldn't be negotiating to defer rent, and that,
that's a really important point, because some states are only offering deferrals, and some owners and agents may be implying that deferral might be the way to go, but I really want to make that point strongly. It's all about reduction without building the debt.
Okay, thanks. That's a really important point to make. So moving towards looking to the future, which we've already started to do to a degree, you talked at the start about some of the issues facing the industry anyway in relation to cost, condition of the property, or basic minimum condition expectations, keeping of pets, you know, terms for eviction and whatnot. What do you think the new rental reform will mean to tenants in the long term as holders of these pretty crucial rights?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that the law is one thing. Actually, giving some rights is one thing. Knowing that you have them is another thing. And then the final thing is being prepared and feel you're able to act on them. So we can get a bit tied up in our little policy world of, well, the law says X, Y, Z, it all should be okay. But of course, if people don't know because the situation's, the law's got increasingly complex, or they're too frightened to act, or they feel like acting would be just really quite complicated and messy, and, then it's not, you may as well not have those rights. So I would make that point first and really encourage people to have a go pushing a case and to ring up Tenants Vic or Legal Aid and get some advice on how to go about it.
Are there some places people can get practical support for even just making that initial step?
Absolutely, yeah. So Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre would definitely be one of those. Legal Aid has a statewide line, Tenants Victoria as well. So you can talk over what your options are. Consumer Affairs take tens of thousands of calls a year, just so people can check what their rights are and then decide whether they want to pursue that repair or, whatever it is that is bugging their lives in rental. Yeah, but some of those new reforms are already in place. So you can keep a pet now. You've got to notify your owner that you intend to, but the owner can't unreasonably refuse. And there've been already a couple of cases that have been tested at VCAT on that. So Rocco, I think he was a boxer, is allowed to stay at the Wodonga property, even though the owner said no. When the owner said no, they have to go to VCAT. They can't just say no. Right. And VCAT said, yes, Rocco can stay. So that happened. There was a German short-haired pointer all set to move into somewhere in Melbourne. The owner said no. And VCAT had a look at it. You can look these cases up actually on VCAT if you're a nerd like I am. And the German short-haired pointer was allowed to stay. They had to do something with the balcony, which was probably safer for the German short-haired pointer, but it's allowed to stay. So those sort of more home-like rights are gradually coming in. Longer leases are available now if you want to take one up and you can get that agreed with your owner. Yep. So there's about to be changes to how bonds are treated, which is a real big bugbear as well, but you don't quite know if you're going to get all your bond back. And so it's going to be moved to a default that you will get it back unless there's an objection, rather than trying to get it out of the owner. So there's some changes like that. Unfortunately, with the COVID law change, they've been pushed back from 1 July to this year to the 1st of January next year. But I'm assured by the Minister, they're on their way still. So all of it is about addressing that cost, condition and homeliness. No reason. You can be given a notice to vacate, not under COVID now, that's been suspended, but for no reason. Then that will be out of the system. So there's a few things that are quite a few things that are improving in the law, but as I say, people really need to get themselves schooled up a little bit on it and be prepared to take action. Just calm, firm. I know that the law's on my side here. This is what I need to do.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. You mentioned the cost reforms, but I'm not sure I understand exactly what they were.
So you can, actually that's already happened too. You can only get one rent increase a year rather than two. That's already happened. Yeah. There will be basic standards to do with heating, which should improve the running costs of properties. So that's actually quite a big one because, those bills can really mount up. Yeah. So there are a couple. There's also some slightly technical stuff I won't go into around how much bond can be asked for, which helps with those upfront costs. But the cost stuff wasn't really tackled very comprehensively. Yeah.
Well, it's market forces are a mighty one to take on. I can't imagine how you legislate against market forces.
But one must be willing. That's right. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I've just got a few, what else? I'll just check my list to make sure I've asked you all the things I wanted to ask you. Was there anything else that I've missed that you wanted to talk about? Probably that's the next thing. We've got just under 10 minutes left of our time.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, our chat group's been rather quiet. We haven't got any questions from the chat. So.
Oh, that's okay, no problem. I think one other thing I'd talk about is one of the issues, I suppose, that the whole system is based on is called contract law. It is Law Week, so I'll get slightly nerdy about that. So that's the basic concept, that a contract is freely entered into between two parties, eyes wide open. Everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone's got the ability to come in or not. Now, I would say that's actually kind of a fundamental problem with tenancy, residential tenancy, because someone who's applying for a property is looking for a place to live and don't have as many choices often in the matter as the person who's letting the property. So there's just a bit of a problem with the way it's all conceptualised. And then that sort of goes on, I'm not a lawyer, but it goes on to sort of say that the parties are relatively equal in power. And if there's a problem, well, one party will just talk to the other party about it and something will be sorted out. So I would say that the problem of needing to raise your voice as a tenant if something's gone wrong for you, whether it's, something needs to be fixed or the landlord's, brother keeps popping around, or whatever it is, that is an issue that I don't quite know what to do about yet, because it would mean kind of a lot of changes in terms of how the whole thing's viewed. But it is a lot to ask of the injured party, if you like. So that's something that I'm kind of grappling with a fair bit. So, for example,
oh, sorry, no, you go.
Oh, Lucy, I was just going to say, for example, with public housing, there's a call for an ombudsman to, when you have trouble with an energy company, you can contact the Energy and Water Ombudsman, who will take on the case for you. And in public housing in Victoria, there's a bit of a push on to have something like that as well. And that's one solution, but it's a very hard one to apply to private rental because of those tens of thousands of individual owners, as opposed to a handful of big energy and water companies or one public housing authority. So to get schemes that kind of really help people sort their problems out without it having to rely too much on them just pushing until they get a solution, is something I'm interested in trying to progress. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic! What a asset that would be. I did notice on the Consumer Affairs website that there was reference to a simpler mediation process or dispute resolution process, which I believe has come about because of COVID-19. I'm not sure. Could you explain a bit more about how things have been simplified in that regard?
Well, that is actually the nearest we've seen to what I'm talking about so far. Yeah, so that literally started last week. It's some people might know about the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. So it's an expansion of what they do. And so if you've tried to get an agreement on rent reduction and it hasn't worked out, you can go through and have your case taken up by the dispute settlement people there, and they will. You'll need to attend, but they will really kind of push through to a solution for you. So it's not just down to you being the kind of engine of the whole thing, I guess. And it can take, I think, some of the misunderstanding out of that you can get into when you're trying to negotiate with somebody. It can take some of that out of it. They're very expert at what they do. They're having to get up to speed very quickly on this area, but I think it's a super interesting consequence of our unfortunate COVID event. And it'll be really, really interesting to see how that goes. Yeah, great.
So you've obviously had some long range projects that you've been working on, and that's all been interrupted by this moment in time. And that would be one of them, in fact. But I wanted to ask you more broadly if you've seen some silver linings of this time. I've heard a few threaded through the conversation, but I wonder if, as a little summary to close, what have been some of the positives, and what do you see will be some of the positives going forward for tenants in the future?
Look, I think what we just discussed, which is that, you know, a dispute settlement, and hopefully it'll have enough cases and go for long enough to prove it out. I think that 500 million was made available very quickly, and that, you know, there was a lot of heaven and earth moved in order to get the legislation through to help tenants. I think that's great, actually. And I hope, even though it would have been great to be able to snap the fingers and have it happen the minute that the lockdown happened, I think that tenants should take heart that did happen and has happened now, and they can make use of it to the best of their own circumstances. I think that the parties who are involved in all this work have had to come together very quickly and make some stuff happen. I think that's always good to build those muscles. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Heather. I think probably the key take homes for me are tenants do have rights, and that those rights are protected and looked after by your role, in fact, and other support organisations and institutions. So so what I'm hearing loud and clear is learn your rights, get help, and make sure that your interests are being looked after as a tenant.
That's right, Lucy. And apparently one of the first places someone asks for advice when they're having a tenancy trouble is friends and family. So even if it's not you, you can encourage people to have a look and you know, walk with them a little bit to make them feel game to take up their issues.
That's great. And in fact, that's a lot about what libraries do also. Interestingly enough, when our doors are open, we are a bit of an unsung hero of walking alongside people as they navigate these sorts of systems. People come to us to use public PCs, they come to us to use Wi-Fi, they come to us to keep warm or to keep cool or to stay away from bushfire conditions or to stay away from unsafe home conditions. And that's often unseen in library services, but I think this is something that we also help people with when we're open, is navigating some of these processes. So
yeah, that's right, and people kind of just on the quietly know that, I think, which is great. My old work at Launch Housing has an outreach worker in the City Library in Melbourne. The City of Melbourne have funded, because of exactly that.
We've talked about doing the same in Bendigo Library, actually, interestingly enough. So thank you again for your time. It's been really interesting and as I said at the start, important. And Victorian community is lucky to have such a experienced and passionate champion for tenancy rights, and that covers the private housing market, but also public caravan parks, residential parks, and rooming houses. So thank you for your lifetime of advocacy, by the sounds of things, on this issue, and then most particularly for your time with us today.
Thanks, Lucy. And you know, everyone should make use of me. Make the voice I'm passing through as complete as possible.
Wonderful. And just before we go, Matt, who's been very helpful with our tech support in the background, is going to pop up some numbers that you can have a look at to follow up some of that advice that Heather's given. So Matt, if you'd like to pop that slide up right now, and then following that will be a little slide just to show you once again what you're part of today, which is our Library in the Lounge Room series of online programs. As you can see, it's a learning curve for all of us, but we're doing our best to bring our services to you in as many and diverse ways as possible while our buildings remain closed, although that might change before too long. And we look forward to getting back to offering you everything that our libraries love offering you. Thank you again, and stay with us just for a little bit while we put up those slides. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, everybody. Go well.
Bye.